Hello, everyone. Today we are beginning a new book and a new series. Our subject is the Second World War. Over the next few months, I will be covering the Second World War in all its dimensions, and the reference book for this series will be The Second World War by historian Anthony Beevor, whose works have received numerous literary awards, have been translated into more than 30 languages, and have sold over 6 million copies worldwide. In today's episode, we will travel to pre-war Europe and the Far East to witness the outbreak of the war. In June 1944, a young soldier surrendered to American paratroopers in Normandy. They initially believed him to be Japanese, but he was in fact Korean. His name was Yang Kyoungjong. In 1938, when he was just 18 years old, he had been forcibly conscripted into the Japanese army in Manchuria. The following year, during the Japanese-Soviet conflict at Khalkhin Gol in Manchuria, he was captured by Soviet forces. In 1942, he was compelled to fight once again, this time as a soldier in the Soviet Red Army. In 1943, during the Battle of Kharkov between Soviet and German forces in Ukraine, he was captured by the German army. In 1944, now wearing a German uniform, he was sent to France. Finally, he surrendered to American troops and would spend the rest of his life in peace in the United States. Yang was one of the relatively fortunate victims of a war that claimed the lives of 60 million people and spread across the entire globe. Yet his story serves as a striking example of how ordinary individuals could be tossed from one side to another within history's great struggles. The Second World War was a global conflict that did not leave a single human being untouched, either directly or indirectly. Some historians define it as a war that began on September 1st, 1939. Others describe it as a 30-year war that had continued since 1914. Still others see it as a conflict that lasted until the end of the Cold War in 1989. Asian historians, meanwhile, often regard 1931, the year Japan occupied Manchuria in China, as the true beginning of the war. Ultimately, it would become the most devastating war humanity has ever experienced, shaping the world we live in today. In Germany, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was offered the opportunity to form a government together with Franz von Papen. When the proposed right-wing coalition could not be established, German President Paul von Hindenburg granted Hitler the authority to govern using extraordinary powers. These powers could have been given to the previous Chancellor, Schleicher, but his status as a general raised fears that he might establish a military dictatorship. Hitler, by contrast, was underestimated. When President Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, Hitler declared himself both president and chancellor. To the outside world, Hitler appeared as a revisionist, someone who sought to change the existing international order in Germany's favor. In 1936, Hitler launched a 4-year program aimed at establishing a war economy. Although preparations had initially been planned for the mid-1940s, the war would begin much earlier. Germany established closer relations with Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had initially been a leftist, but after personally participating in the war and being wounded, and following Italy's exclusion from war spoils after the conflict, he became a right-wing journalist writing extensively on these grievances. In 1921, he became the leader, Deuce, of the Italian fascist movement, and 1 year later he became prime minister. During his first 10 years in office, he avoided actions that might provoke foreign powers. However, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and during the Spanish Civil War that began in 1936, Italy actively supported the nationalist forces led by Francisco Franco. The Spanish Civil War was an uprising initiated by the right-wing general Francisco Franco against the ruling socialist government. Although the socialists initially retained control over much of the country, including Madrid, the balance shifted when Italy and Germany supported Franco in response to Soviet support for the socialists. Franco ultimately won the war and ruled Spain from 1939 to 1975. Both Hitler and Mussolini sought to expand their country's borders and appealed to similar social dynamics. Both nations had arrived late to the 19th-century colonial race, received a smaller share of imperial gains, and were deeply disappointed by the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference. In 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland, which had been designated a demilitarized zone. Owing to the Spanish Civil War, the international community did not respond forcefully to the occupation of the Rhineland. British policymakers feared that if Germany were allowed to dominate the European continent unchallenged, Britain would face a powerful enemy close to home. Yet attempting to stop Germany might weaken Britain and force it to relinquish its global role to the United States. For this reason, British leaders of the era believed that the outbreak of another European war would harm Britain regardless of the outcome. Consequently, they pursued a policy of appeasement, offering Germany concessions from the Treaty of Versailles. Under this policy, diplomacy was to be used to prevent a major war, and the aggressor was to be placated through limited concessions in order to prevent further demands. Before 1940, the United States had no ambition to save Europe. Although President Roosevelt envisioned a system in which America would act as a global leader, the American public was not yet prepared for such a role. Isolationism remained popular, and throughout the 1930s there was no American intervention in Europe. The Munich Conference, held 1 year before September 1939, marked a critical moment in European diplomacy. Britain and France approved Germany's union with Austria and the occupation of German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia. Yet in 1939, Britain and France offered security guarantees to Poland. Why had policies changed within a single year, and why was Hitler determined to provoke war? First and foremost, Hitler's character was inherently bellicose, driven by a burning desire to acquire new territory for the German nation. His primary objectives were Austria and Czechoslovakia. Although some generals within the army warned that Germany was unprepared for a major war, figures close to Hitler, such as Göring and Ribbentrop, strongly supported military action. The first test came with the attempt to unify with Austria. Although the Austrian Chancellor proposed a referendum on the issue, German troops entered Austria and unification was achieved without resistance from external powers. Encouraged by this success, Hitler next turned his attention to the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia inhabited largely by ethnic Germans. In May 1938, Germany threatened military intervention following ethnic unrest in the region. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 had established Western European borders but left Central and Eastern Europe unresolved. By this point, both Germany and the Soviet Union had grown stronger, and the future of these regions was once again open to negotiation. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that all disputes could be resolved through negotiation with Hitler, thereby avoiding another war. In August 1938, he began mediating the Sudeten crisis. Hitler, however, preferred to resolve the matter through force. Although concessions were promised, Hitler was unwilling to wait and wanted to deploy his troops immediately. Eventually, following Mussolini's advice and after France and Czechoslovakia were persuaded, Hitler agreed to negotiations. On September 28, 1938, Mussolini, French Prime Minister Daladier, Chamberlain, and Hitler met in Munich and agreed that the Sudetenland would be annexed by Germany. Chamberlain believed that a major war had been averted and that European stability had been restored. Hitler, however, had achieved his objective. During the winter of 1938 to 1939, Germany accelerated the expansion of its naval and air forces while strengthening ties with Italy and Japan, increasingly threatening Britain. In March 1939, Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, while Slovakia declared independence as a German client state. Following the agreement with Stalin on the partition of Poland, Germany began preparations for war against Poland. Britain watched with growing concern as Germany rearmed and persecution of Jews intensified. When Britain and France guaranteed Poland's security, Hitler announced the cancellation of non-aggression pacts with Poland and Britain and concluded a 10-year cooperation agreement with Italy. Ribbentrop believed Britain and France were bluffing and would not risk war over Poland, just as they had not done over Czechoslovakia. He also underestimated the Soviet Union, though Germany hoped that bringing the Soviets into an agreement would deter Britain and France from entering the war. Finally, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Hitler had hoped for a limited regional conflict, but instead, Germany found itself embroiled in a major war for which its armaments were not yet fully prepared. Defending Poland became a symbol of refusing to grant the Nazis global dominance and of the unavoidable responsibilities of great power status. Beyond Europe, another rising power on the world stage was Japan. Its defeat of Russia in 1905 had inspired oppressed peoples worldwide. Japan's growing influence in the region, driven by Pan-Asianism, the goal of liberating Asia from Western powers under Japanese leadership, ultimately led to the Pacific War. Japan's rise began with China's decline. In the mid-19th century, the Qing dynasty weakened due to internal rebellions and Western imperialism. Russia and Japan sought to fill the resulting power vacuum. Japan defeated China in 1894, and after defeating Russia in 1905, occupied Taiwan, southern Manchuria, and Korea. Following the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Japan established political and economic hegemony over China. Japan industrialized during the First World War and seized German colonies in China and the Pacific. Its economic expansion threatened American interests, leading the United States to view Japan's rise with suspicion. The Manchurian Crisis erupted when China demanded Japan's withdrawal from Manchuria. Rising tensions culminated in 1931 when the Japanese Kwantung Army, acting without authorization from Tokyo, launched military operations and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. Many within the Japanese military believed that access to natural resources, such as minerals, was essential for sustaining a future war, and that control of Manchuria was vital for an island nation like Japan. Ultranationalists advocating Asian unity and expulsion of Western powers gained influence. After the moderate Japanese government lost elections in 1931 and its leader was assassinated, Emperor Hirohito appointed the ultranationalist Admiral Makoto Saito as prime minister. From that point until 1945, Japan pursued an expansionist policy under military rule, withdrawing from the League of Nations and arms limitation treaties. Japan moved closer to Germany, signing the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, joined by Italy a year later. In 1940, the three nations formally became the Axis powers. In fact, the Second World War began not on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, but earlier, on May 11th, 1939, with the Battle of Khalkhin Gol between Japan and the Soviet Union along the China-Mongolia border. When Soviet cavalry commander Georgy Zhukov was summoned to Moscow in June 1939, he bid farewell to his family, convinced he would be executed like many others during Stalin's purges. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin had arrested more than 30,000 military officers, executing many of them. Contrary to Zhukov's fears, he was sent to the Mongolian border and ordered to neutralize the Japanese threat. After clashes beginning on the 11th of May, fighting continued throughout the summer. On the 20th of August, the Red Army launched a decisive offensive, annihilating the 61,000-strong Japanese Kwantung Army. Soviet losses numbered 7,974. The victory eliminated the Japanese threat in the east and enabled the Soviets to sign a non-aggression pact with Germany, agreeing to the partition of Poland. Zhukov returned to Moscow not as a victim but as a hero, receiving a medal from Stalin himself. He would go on to become one of the Soviet Union's greatest commanders in the war against Germany. One of Hitler's key ideological concepts was Lebensraum, or living space. According to this idea, the superior German race required new territories in which to grow, primarily in Poland and the Soviet Union. However, Hitler first sought to neutralize France and Britain before turning eastward. Once Europe was dominated and the Soviet Union and socialism destroyed, Germany could then compete with the United States for global supremacy. To secure Soviet neutrality, a non-aggression pact was signed, granting eastern Poland to the Soviets. When news of the agreement reached Hitler on 21st August, he reportedly struck the table in triumph. He believed Britain and France, unable to ally with the Soviets, would not intervene. On 24th August, the British embassy in Berlin received a coded telegram and began destroying sensitive documents. Diplomatic staff prepared to depart as German forces massed along the Polish border. After deliberately stalling Polish negotiations, Germany launched Operation White on 31st August. A fabricated incident was staged to justify the invasion, involving SS agents attacking German installations while dressed as Polish soldiers. Ironically, the war's first victims were concentration camp prisoners murdered to support a lie. The war began at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, when a German warship bombarded a Polish military base in Danzig. At the same time, 50 German divisions crossed the Polish border. This brings us to the end of today's episode. In the next episode, we will examine the invasion of Poland. You can support the channel by following and sharing it with your friends. I believe this will be a strong and compelling series. Thank you for your support.